to begin, because you all can't join us in person today, we thought we'd show you a short, just 2-minute video to show you our space and give you kind of a short overview of who we are.
The Hub Farm is an educational facility owned by Durham Public Schools. We've got about 30 acres here, and we host field trips for kids to learn all about sustainable agriculture and environmental education and how they connect their lives to the outdoors. We have some forest trails, a garden, chickens, we've got ducks, we've got an apiary, so we have 3 honeybee hives right now. The background idea was hub is like the hub of a wheel, and the spokes go out to schools and the different parts of the community. It is one of the only educational farms that's owned and operated by a public school system in this region. It's a special place because lots of people care about it, and lots of kids get to discover new things here.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. All right. So that's the Hub Farm. So on to our agenda for our presentation today. We will begin by introducing the fungus kingdom, and then we will get into the anatomy and life cycle of gilled mushrooms. In lieu of our typical in-person mushroom inoculation workshop, which we offer, we will show y'all a short step-by-step demonstration video, and then we will finish up by discussing log care and maintenance, and then harvesting and storage methods. And again, we will leave time at the end for your questions. All right, so what is a fungus? So fungi are a kingdom of eukaryotes separate from plants and animals. And this kingdom is divided into yeasts, molds, and mushrooms. And you can see on this phylogenetic tree, the fungi kingdom is circled. You can kind of get an idea of where it's placed. Fungi are distinct from plants because their cell walls are made of chitin, not cellulose. And because they do not gain energy from the sun using chlorophyll, but rather they gain energy from absorbing nutrients through their mycelial networks. And one of my favorite facts about fungi is that they are actually more closely related to animals, and therefore us humans, than plants. So what is a mushroom? The mushroom is the reproductive fruiting body of the fungal organism. It is the part we eat, if the mushroom is edible, of course. Mushrooms are only present when it is time for the fungus to reproduce. And today we will focus on gilled mushrooms in this presentation, though mushrooms are subdivided into cap fungi, boletes, and puffballs.
So now we're going to take a closer look at that fungal body that Hannah was talking about, the reproductive body of a gilled mushroom. So gilled mushrooms are made up of many parts that all contribute to the reproduction of the fungus itself. So looking a little bit closer, the top part of the mushroom is called the cap, and this is where the gills and the spores are housed. So the gills are found on the underside of the cap, and they're a series of flat surfaces radially arranged from the center, and they increase surface area for spore production. So the spores themselves are microscopic single-celled units containing genetic reproductive information. And this is kind of roughly analogous to seeds. So Hannah was saying, these aren't plants, but you can kind of use a lot of analogies to explain what's happening in the reproduction of a fungi like mushrooms, gilled mushrooms. So the spores are produced in the gills, and since the mushroom is rooted in place, it sends out puffs of these spores and relies on wind to carry the spores to different locations. And then once separate from the mushroom body, the spores germinate into single-celled mycelium, which those can't reproduce on their own. So when two of these compatible single-celled mycelia join, they form a multi-celled organism called a hyphae. And those links of hyphae form a mycelial network. And those eventually reproduce again using mushrooms. And we'll touch on this life cycle in a few slides so that you can see what that looks like from start to finish. Next is the ring. So the ring is a skirt-like layer of tissue circling the stem of a mature mushroom. And this part of the mushroom is a remnant of the veil. So the veil is a protective layer of the tissue that connects the stem and the cap before the gills are exposed. So this is when it's growing out of the substrate. Next is the stem or the stipe, and this is the main support of the mushroom, and it's topped by the cap. So using another plant analogy, this is like the support structure of lots of flowers, growing plants that have stems. Then below at the bottom, at the base of the mushroom, is the vulva, and it's a cup-shaped structure at the base of the mushroom. The basal cup is the remnant of the button, which is the round, undeveloped mushroom before the fruiting body appears and before the cap opens up to expose the gills. So the main part of the organism is the mycelium. And mycelium is a network of root-like filaments, that's the hyphae we were talking about earlier, that anchors the mushroom into the soil or whatever substrate it's growing out of and consumes nutrients from the surrounding substrate. So that's does the decomposing portion. Mushrooms spend most of their life cycle consuming nutrients as mycelium. Mycelium are present even when there are no mushrooms, because the mushroom is that fruiting body, the reproductive part of the mushroom. So in one really cool fact, Hannah shared her neat fact about mushrooms, and this is another really interesting fact, that in a single cubic inch of soil, there are an estimated 8 miles of mycelia present. So this is a massive network of this fungi, and you can't even see it, it's below the ground. So here's that mushroom life cycle we were talking about. And the mushroom life cycle begins in a matrix of mycelium. So the mycelium are made up of those hyphae that grow into a suitable substrate. So for our case, this is logs, since we're inoculating logs. And then they develop into primordia, which is just a fancy word for saying baby mushrooms. The primordia eventually become mature mushrooms, which is the fruiting body, and those produce spores. The spores then carry genetic material to grow mycelium elsewhere, and that cycle repeats.
Great. So moving on to different types of mushrooms. There are many different popular types of gilled edible mushrooms to grow at home, including mushrooms you might have heard of like lion's mane, cinnamon cap, and reishi. And we will discuss the two most popular kinds to grow in the North Carolina Piedmont region where we are situated. And so those are oyster and shiitake mushrooms. We no longer grow oyster mushrooms at the Hub Farm, as we found they are much more susceptible to fast rot in the wet, humid Durham summers. Shiitakes are a much more hardy variety and hold up better in the moist, hot climate here. But perhaps in your home, your microclimate, you will be able to grow oyster mushrooms as well. So oyster mushrooms were first grown commercially for subsistence in Germany in World War I, because they are incredibly high in protein and vitamins, even more so than shiitake mushrooms. And so that is why a lot of vegetarians or vegans rely on mushrooms as a really good source of protein. And it's popular for its many different colors. You might have seen it in gray, kind of a purpley beige, many different colors. And it has a really amazing sort of seafood-like umami taste. And in its native environment, oyster mushrooms grow in temperate and tropical forests on trees. And unlike other mushrooms, oyster mushrooms are carnivorous. So they can actually kill and digest nematodes, which other mushrooms cannot do. Oyster mushrooms are best grown in bags filled with wheat straw or sawdust, or on softwood trees, such as poplar species, soft maples, sweet gum trees, and box elder trees. So shiitakes, a little bit about shiitakes. Shiitakes are the second most produced mushroom in the world, so they are incredibly popular. And they originated a few thousand years ago in Japan. People found them growing on dead she trees, and they would put fresh logs next to those trees so that the spores would spread. and people would then collect the mushrooms once they were mature off of those wild logs. So the name shiitake comes from that shi word. Shiitakes are best grown in hardwood sawdust bags or on hardwood logs like we are going to show you today. And the best trees for growing shiitakes are sugar maple and white oak. And then the second tier down below that are trees like ironwood, musclewood, and beech trees. We are using sweet gum trees at the hub farm because they are really plentiful in our forest, and they grow in our woods kind of like weeds in a garden. And so we sustainably harvest them, and we use that as a learning experience for our students to talk about responsible forestry and sustainable harvesting methods. Next slide. Awesome. So we are going to pause here to show you all a video of mushroom inoculation, like we mentioned earlier. And afterwards, we will go through the steps listed in the video. And these will also be available in a handout that Piedmont Environmental Alliance will share with all of you after this presentation. So don't worry if you can't get all of this information down in note form. We will go over it again, and you will also get that handout. And we might have some technological glitches with this video. If we do, we'll just pause and move forward, and this video can be found on our YouTube, and we will also reference that at the end of the presentation. All right, go for it, Erin.
Hello! Today we are going to be showing you how to grow your own edible mushrooms from log to plate. To begin, choose a shaded area for storing your mushroom log, preferably on the edge of a forest sheltered from the wind. Select a small tree on your property to cut down while dormant. Trees are dormant a few weeks after leaf fall in autumn, until a few weeks before bud break in the spring, when carbohydrates in the wood are at their highest levels and the bark is adhering tightly to the tree. We typically choose sweet gum because those are the most abundant on our property. Once cut, your log should be about 3 feet long and about 4 to 6 inches in diameter. If you are not cutting down your own tree, reach out to your local arborist to inquire about logs. Now let's take a look at all of the necessary materials for mushroom inoculation. You will need a log, a cheese grater, personal protective equipment including eyewear and earwear, mushroom plug spawn, a single burner camping stove, fuel for the stove, cheese wax, nails, aluminum tags, a pot that can get dirty, a pot for melting wax that can also get dirty, paintbrushes, a hammer, and a drill. Because it takes a while, the first thing that you'll want to do is melt your wax. First, turn on your stove and ignite it. We are using a Coleman Bunsen burner stove. For this stove, we unlock it in the front and add in our butane fuel before relocking it. We want to make sure that it has a good connection so no fuel is lost. Turn the stove to medium heat. The goal here is to create a double boiler and bring the water up to a low boil. We set our pot of water to boil, adjusting the heat as necessary. And add the pot that the wax will go into. While you're waiting for the water to boil, begin grating your cheese wax into the pot. You can use the largest size hole on the grater to increase surface area and speed up the melting time. This grater will also get waxy, so be aware. Once you've grated a sufficient amount, set the pot back on the boiling water to melt. Next up, it's time to prepare your log. Before we begin drilling, make sure to take all necessary safety precautions. If you have long hair like me, tie it back away from your face. Put on protective eyewear like these safety glasses and protective earwear like these earplugs. Gloves are optional. Now we're all set to start drilling. To optimize the number of inoculated dowels in your log, measure holes every 4 inches, using your pinky and pointer finger as a guide. Starting at the end of your log, you're going to drill holes every 4 inches. You only need to drill about 1 inch down into the log, which is the length of 1 dowel. Continue this process until you've drilled the full length of the log. Remember to move your fingers out of the way to avoid any unnecessary trips to urgent care. Once you have drilled your first line of holes, rotate your log to begin the next line. Measure the next set of holes approximately 4 inches over from the first line, but stagger each hole. You will still drill every 4 inches again, but the staggering will create a zigzag pattern. See how the start of the second row is offset from your first. Keep drilling every 4 inches down this line. Continue this process of rotating and drilling until you get back to your first drill line. Now comes the fun part of inoculating your log. Today, we'll be inoculating our log with shiitake mushroom plug spawn. The wooden dowels are inoculated with the mycelia, so when we pound them into our log, the mycelia will start to take over. We like to start by placing the dowels into our pre-drilled holes. Then, we hammer each one of them into the log until they are flush with the bark. Complete this process for your whole log, filling in all of the pre-drilled holes. Next, we'll tag each log. To remember when and what you inoculated your log with, use an aluminum tag to note the mushroom type, the specific strain, and the date you inoculated your log. This will be very helpful if you inoculate multiple years in a row or if you try out different varieties of mushrooms. For our example today, we inoculated our log with shiitake mushroom spawn, strain Westwind, or WW for short, on April 9th, 2021. Use a nail and a hammer to secure your tag. Then, you're on to the final step. Time to cover up your plugs with wax. The last step in the inoculation process is to cover up each dowel with a little bit of cheese wax. Your wax should be nice and melted now, so use a paintbrush or a cotton dauber to cover each hole with a small amount of wax. The wax will melt rather quickly, so the hotter the wax, the easier this process is. The waxing process is extremely important because you are restoring the integrity of the original bark. When you damage the bark by drilling into it, the potential for a foreign fungal strain to enter the log increases. The wax will be hot, so be careful not to burn yourself. When the wax dries, it should look like this. The dowels should be completely covered. Setting your log. Once you've inoculated your log, it's time to give it a home. Choose a partly shaded location where you can lean your log against a wall or a tree. All of our mushrooms reside here in Mushroom Gorge. Each log is stacked in an A-frame style using cording strung up between 2 trees. We've inoculated quite a few logs over the past few years. When you stack your logs, try to only have 1 or 2 contact points with other logs. This will make it easier for the mushrooms to fruit and help you spot new fruiting bodies. Now all you have to do is wait. Happy growing! Thanks for watching. If you're interested in learning more about mushroom inoculation, please check out the resources listed in the description below.
Awesome. So like Hannah was saying, we will definitely share out this video. So if you guys like following along when you're doing a tutorial and having the video up while you're doing that, you can do that with this video. In addition, we do have this kind of checklist that you can use if you're more of a checklist person. So you can go through each step following along, but we'll just go ahead and briefly go over each of these steps. So the first thing that you want to do when setting up your inoculation process is select your shiitake site. So you're going to want something that has is mostly shaded, doesn't get a lot of wind, but can still get rain. So we choose the edge of our forest line here at the Hub Farm. The next thing that you're going to want to do is order your mushroom spawn plugs. So this can take a little bit of time. So we recommend doing it right at the start of winter, or you can order them early and keep them in a refrigerator. We order ours from the same location, and that is on the handout that you guys will be given. The next thing that you'll do is select a small tree to cut down while dormant, or you can reach out to a local forestry service if you don't have any trees that you would like to fell on your property. It's really important to cut down the tree while dormant during the winter months, because that's when the bark is adhered tightly to the tree, and all of those good nutrients that your mycelium will then live on are still within the bark. So if you are doing this yourself, we recommend wearing personal protective equipment. This can be a very dangerous process. So if you don't have training in it, reach out to someone that does. Next, you'll want to cut that larger tree into segments. In our video, we used a very short segment. That makes it difficult to stack your logs. So make sure they're about 3 to 4 feet in length. This also optimizes how many plugs you can put into your log. And then obviously optimizes how much fruiting bodies and mushrooms you will be able to produce. Next, you'll drill rows spaced 4 inches apart. This diagram does a little bit better job showing what those holes will look like once they're drilled. The video was a little bit hard to tell where they were in relation to one another. So you can see that there are these little diamond shapes that form because you're offsetting your rows of 4 inches. So you'll drill one straight line down the length of your log, then rotate another 4 inches, either in the clockwise or counterclockwise direction, and then offset your log, or offset your holes in your log. And this, again, just optimizes how many holes you can put in your log. Next, you'll pound one plug into each hole. Those plugs have the mycelium on them. So when you pound them into your log, you're inoculating the log with that mycelium so that they can take over and start eating the inside and decomposing the inside of your log. Next, you'll melt cheese wax in the double boiler, keeping the wax hot, and you'll paint a thin layer over each dowel that secures the bark. You want to make sure that no other foreign fungal bodies take over your log. We've seen mushrooms like turkey tail take over our logs if we don't do that process properly. So you want to make sure that your inoculated log and your inoculated spawn has no other mushrooms to compete with. So that's a very important process. Next, you'll scratch the variety name and date onto an aluminum tag. Like we were saying in the video, this is important if you have lots of different logs. It can be hard to remember what year you inoculated them if you aren't tagging them, and then also what strain you have. Lastly, you'll stack your logs low to the ground on pallets. It's really important to make sure that they are on pallets, and we'll talk a little bit about why in some upcoming slides. But we want to show you a few different ways you can stack your logs. So here are 3 different ways. We tend to use the A-frame just because we have a lot of logs. So we stack the logs by using cording strung up between trees. And this is a great method if you have a lot of logs because you can easily see fruiting bodies between the logs, and you can rotate the logs and check them to harvest them. And you can also easily switch out logs when they start to decay. So this is great for us, but we also have a lot of forest space. If you don't have a lot of forest space or trees that you can string up cording between, you can also just lean your logs up against a fence line or a shed that you might have. The next style is the Lincoln log style, seen in picture 2. This one is a little bit tricky to harvest from because, as you can imagine, if you have a mushroom growing inside that log, you'd have to kind of disassemble the whole structure in order to harvest it. But some mushroom growers really love it because it's a very stable structure. The last method is the cone method, which is helpful if you don't have a structure like a fence or cording or a shed to prop your logs against. In this method, you use the logs themselves to support each other, and you can still they're still easily accessible to harvest the mushrooms from. All 3 of these photos and descriptions are in the handout that will be given to you, so you can reference that as well. Next, so once you've inoculated your logs, you'll start to see fruiting happen within the first kind of 6 months post-inoculation in the fall or the spring. Your logs will naturally flush after a rainfall or a cold snap because the fungi themselves, that mycelia body, is really stressed out, so it starts to reproduce by sending out fruiting bodies. So you can expect, you do have to be patient and wait about 6 months, but once you do, you'll get some natural flushes. The logs will need, just for in terms of water, the logs will need about 1 inch of rain per week. So if you are kind of in a dry spell, you'll want to water your logs with a hose for a few minutes, kind of daily or a few times a week in those dry rain spells. And if you want to force fruiting, you can soak the logs in cold water for 12 to 24 hours during the summer months. So commercial farmers will do this. They'll regularly soak their logs and have them on a rotating schedule to increase production. But here at the Hub Farm, we're focused more on education rather than production. So we take a kind of set it and forget it approach. But if you want to try this soaking method to force fruit, you are more than welcome to do that. And then lastly, you definitely want to keep your logs up off the ground using wooden pallets or concrete slabs or bricks, however you'd like to do it, just to reduce decomposer pest pressure from slugs, roly-polies, or worms. Slugs will love to eat your mushrooms as well, so you want to make sure that you check regularly to harvest your mushrooms before the slugs get them.
Great. So a little bit about harvesting and storing your mushrooms once they're mature. So the first thing we like to remind people is to monitor your logs regularly. So after that first 6 months period, when the mycelia is starting to take over and colonize the log, so likely the spring or fall after you inoculate, you're going to start seeing your mushrooms start to fruit. So you want to be monitoring those logs frequently. Once they start to fruit, you want to harvest them pretty soon after. So that's why you want to keep an eye on your log. And if you shock your log, like Erin was saying, if you give them a soaking to force fruit them, then the mushrooms should be ready to harvest about a week to 10 days later. And so you might wonder, how do I know when the mushroom's ready to be harvested? Well, the gills should be visible. So the cap should have opened up enough that you can start to see the gills. And the outer edge of the mushroom should still be slightly curled under. So if the edge has fully flattened out, then the mushroom is slightly overripe. It's still edible, you can still eat it, but it won't store in the refrigerator for as long. So we recommend eating those ones in the same day that you harvest them, if possible. To harvest the mushroom, there are 2 different methods. You can grab the mushroom, twist it, and pull it off. Or our other method is you can just cut it off with a small knife. But in either method, you want to avoid damaging the bark because, again, the bark is providing protection for that mycelial body and not allowing any foreign fungal strains to get into the bark. So try not to damage the bark when you're harvesting. And then as far as storage goes, mushrooms are actually pretty shelf stable in a cold space. So they can actually last for up to 14 days in a sealed storage container. We usually store in a Tupperware container or even a plastic bag works. And if you're not going to eat them within that time period, then we recommend drying them for future use. So you can dry them either in your oven by setting your oven to its lowest temperature setting around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, cutting them in slices and then laying them out on a cookie sheet or a tray, and then baking them for at least 3 to 4 hours until they really start to to, to shrivel up and for all of the moisture to be sucked out of them. And of course, if you're using your oven, you want to make sure that you're home during that period. You're not just leaving your oven on and then going about your day. Stay home, make sure that you're watching those shiitakes and your oven as well. And then if you have a food dehydrator, you can also use that for drying. And then for rehydrating your mushrooms later on, in the months where maybe mushrooms aren't fruiting as much and you really want to get a taste of that shiitake, you can rehydrate them using boiling water, and that will bring them back. And then we love using them in soups or stews. They're traditionally used in ramen to create your ramen stock. And then fresh mushrooms, of course, can be used in a variety of ways. Some of our favorite ways are in a pasta, in a frittata, on top of toast. So many different options there. All right, so that kind of wraps up our presentation portion today. And we're just so grateful to get the opportunity to present to you all and share a little bit about the Hub Farm and the mushroom production that we do here at the Hub Farm. This is an image of our farm. You can see our big red barn, which is also right behind me in this image. And we would love to actually have you out to the farm physically in person. And so you can, our final slide will show you after questions. We'll have our contact information along with our website and our social media. So now we can open it up to questions if we have any questions. And I'm looking in here now, I see, what is cheese wax? That is a great question. Cheese wax, I don't know if it's the same as paraffin. I don't think it is. Cheese wax you can order online, either on Googling cheese wax and ordering it from a store online, or you can order it from Field and Forest, which is where we order all of our mushroom supplies. And again, those resources will be included in the handout that we're going to send you via email. And it looks like we've got another question. Would the spring season count as a good time to cut a tree down? Erin, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. I've got that one. So you want to try and cut your logs down or your trees down during the winter months. So more so in the January, February months. Now, because all of the trees have turned green and are giving all of their nutrients out to their leaves, and are starting to flower and reproduce themselves, their bark or their trunks don't have all of that good sugars and nutrients that the mycelium would like to munch on. So it's not a great time right now. But yes, good question. You'll have to wait until the winter months, unfortunately. If you do want to reach out to someone who may have felled some trees during the winter months, you might still be able to reach out to someone as long as they've stored their logs in an area that wouldn't have been inoculated by some foreign fungi. You could try that, but it's really best to fell them in the winter months.
Yeah, and then I see another question along with that about, can you use a log that was cut last year, or does it have to be freshly cut? That's a great question. You should use a log that was cut down within the last about 4 weeks. So you don't want to use logs that were cut down last year, because unfortunately at that point the chitin that the mycelia consumes is dead. So there's not a lot of organic matter in there for the mushrooms to eat. So you really want to get one that was cut down within the last 4 weeks. And like Erin said, you need to get those logs cut down before bud break, before the buds start to come out on trees. And we get our spawn plugs from this online catalog called Field and Forest. And that is, if you type into Google Field and Forest, I think it's fieldandforest.net maybe, we just order from them, and you want to order about a month in advance of when you want to start inoculating, just because it is a mail service. And there are a few other local mushroom suppliers. I believe Haw River Mushrooms sells dowels as well. And there's a few different forms as well of ways to inoculate. So if you're not using the wooden dowels like we use, there's also kind of like it's a tool that you use to kind of punch in a bag of spores and then punch into your bag of sawdust or straw. There's a few different ways. Looks like another question about storing spawn. Do you want me to answer that, Erin, or you want to answer that one?
You can answer it either way.
Okay, great. So the question is, how long can you store spawn in your freezer after purchase? That's another great question. So we generally store our spawn in our refrigerator. We've never stored it in a freezer. So this might look a little different, but we have stored spawn for a full year in our fridge, in our refrigerator, and then use them the following year for inoculation. Which the spawn is still viable. The spawn is still growing. The only problem is that the dowel, the wooden dowel, because it's wood, once again, that mycelia is consuming that wooden dowel. So the dowel itself starts to sort of, it's a little less, it holds together less well. So when you're hammering your plugs in with a spawn that's a year old, sometimes it'll mush a little bit. So it depends on how far along that wooden dowel has advanced in being consumed by the mycelia. So you can certainly store it for a year. It'll still be viable. It depends, though, on how far along the dowels are in their decomposition process. Hope that answered the question. Sure.
Well, so we have another question that says, can you use stumps living from trees harvested last year? This woman, she said, we did a select cut of 38 acres of red and white oaks. So here at the Hub Farm, we haven't used any live stumps. I would imagine that you can use those. There are lots of other ways to inoculate mushrooms that people can use. I've seen people dig in their stumps into the ground and kind of build a substrate of sand beneath it to kind of keep in water. That's one way. We haven't used living stumps. I would imagine if they've been harvested in the winter and if you can drill into them, I'm sure that you can. We can give you more information too about that. I don't know, Hannah, have you ever used stumps in the past that are living to inoculate?
So good question. So stumps, I'm sure you could use stumps, and of course red and white oak are highly preferable. But the only problem, sorry, we have a field trip. There's all of our kids. We have a small field trip of students today. So the stump is, the only problem is that it's a really wide diameter. Generally stumps are going to be, 2 to 3 feet wide. So, and we prefer 4 to 6 inches in diameter. But I think it could be a good experiment, literally drilling holes directly into that stump while it's still in the ground and trying to inoculate that way. It could be a great experiment. And then we got another question about the best types of trees to use. And you said you have lots of pine trees. So pine trees, evergreens, coniferous trees are not good to use for mushroom inoculation. So we really recommend deciduous hardwood trees, like those sweet gums, those oak trees, those poplar species. The problem with the problem with coniferous and evergreen trees is that they produce sap. And so the sap actually is not good for the mycelia to eat. Do you get more than one fruiting from one plug after cutting the first mushroom? Yeah, you want to answer that, Erin?
Perfect. Yeah, I can do that one. So what you're seeing fruiting is not actually the plug. So the plug itself is just inoculating. You can kind of think about it as a vaccine in the human body. When you get vaccinated, those antibodies travel throughout your entire person. And it's the same thing with logs. So when you inoculate with a plug, the mushrooms will sprout anywhere throughout the log. It's not just on that one space where the plug is. The plug just starts the inoculation within the whole of the log. So the mycelia, the plugs are inoculated with mycelia that will then take over the interior of the log. So if you were to kind of do a slice down the middle of your log, you would see that mycelial network within your log, and then they'll sprout anywhere from the bark of the tree. So you'll see fruiting bodies come from like the tops of your logs, the outer parts of your logs, through the bark on even places where you didn't drill, because they'll fruit from wherever in the log, because the whole log on the inside will be taken over by that fungal body. Great question. There's another question. Do you find deer or other wildlife an issue? So I think the biggest issue is other decomposers that get into that area, especially because we're kind of in a shaded, wet area. That's where the mushrooms love to grow. And that's also where slugs like to be, decomposers, bugs, that sort of thing. So that's why Hannah mentioned that it's always great if you've flushed your logs, or if you're at that 6-month marker post inoculation, to start checking your logs regularly for mushroom production, because you'll want to try and get your mushrooms before the slugs and other decomposers get at them. But Hannah likes to say we like to do a little bit of sharing. So we take some, we leave some for the slugs. So if you want to leave some for your native friends, we welcome that as well. Good question.
And I'll just add on to that. Yeah, we've never had any issue with mammals eating mushrooms. You would think they might, because they are good sources of protein, but we've never had like a rabbit or a deer or a raccoon eat a mushroom directly off of the log. Like Erin said, it's really just those smaller decomposers and insects. Awesome. Any other final questions? Okay, one question about moss. I have moss that grows freely in my area. Will this interfere with mushrooms on the logs? Again, when you're storing your logs, once you've inoculated them, they should be lifted off of the ground, either on a wooden pallet or on bricks or concrete blocks like Erin mentioned. And so the moss shouldn't be a problem, because there shouldn't be any contact with the bottom of the mushroom and the ground. The mushroom should be elevated off of the ground. So it should be fine to grow in an area with moss. Any final questions before we wrap up? Awesome.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you all so much again for joining us today. It was a lovely day to sit here on our floating classroom and talk about mushrooms with everyone. It makes me want to go eat some right now. And we would love for you all to stay in touch. So here are our emails: Hannah and Erin at thehubfarm.org. Our website is found at thehubfarm.org. And then our video that Erin beautifully made and produced is located on our YouTube channel. And you can just type DPS Hub Farm into your search bar, and that should take you to our YouTube channel. And then please give us a follow. Give us a follow on social media. We're on both Instagram and Twitter at DPS Hub Farm, all one word, lowercase. Yeah, so thank you again for your interest in Durham Public Schools and in growing mushrooms. Hope everyone enjoys their weekend.
Thanks for your time, everyone.